Hello everyone, how have you been? I'm Ari Thurger, and today I'm going to talk about the Scandinavian traditions that can be perceptible in the movie Midsommar. I don't always do this. Well, in fact, this is the very first time I am making a sort of movie review. In all honesty, I'm doing this because my patrons asked me, otherwise I don't even think I would watch the movie. Don't get me wrong, I love movies, but I just don't have a lot of free time lately. That's all. Anyway, in this video today, I'm not going to make a review on the entire action of the movie, nor a criticism on the way it was directed, and all of that. I'm going to focus solely on the aspects of culture and how they have been portrayed in the movie. If it is indeed an exaggeration, far from the truth, or closer, and what links does it have with actual Norse mythology and Scandinavian folk traditions. I'm going to explore the movie on those fields with a certain academic approach to it. I have seen other works from the writer and director of this movie, Ari Hester. His movies are kind of slow at the beginning to build up the atmosphere so you can enter in the very uncomfortable ambience, not entirely to create fear, but a sense of dread and anxiety, as if nowadays the already existing anxiety we constantly have to deal with wasn't enough. But in this particular movie, Midsommar, I enjoyed the idea of creating a different type of horror movie in broad daylight. After all, it is midsummer. It's a very bright movie, lots of light, and I think Ari Aster worked really well in giving us horror in broad daylight, because most horror movies are indeed either during the night or a very dark atmosphere, which just becomes a cliche. And it's not easy to express horror in very bright sceneries. Our mind is already predisposed to acknowledge something more negative coming from darkness, and not the opposite. So the impact of this movie, I think it's quite unexpected, and I enjoyed it because of that. But in all honesty, I know the movie is labeled as horror movie, but I didn't see it as horror. I think it's a movie quite rich in tradition, and it presents a clash of mentalities. What our ancestors were doing in the past shock us today, but in the past it was acceptable, it was normal, it was tradition. Things change, obviously, mentalities change, and I think Ari Hester played well with this clash of mentalities. Those that kept the old traditions and somewhat the mentality of the past, and those who moved on and the mentality is, well, absolutely different. So this is one of the reasons I don't consider this movie, actual horror, because indeed we seem to be dealing in here with a case of mentality towards tradition. One last point before we really start to talk about the actual purpose of this video is that by the time I've recorded this video, the movie isn't in the movie theaters yet, where I live. Hello from the past. So, because my patrons insisted, I have found other ways to watch the movie. Terrible choice, because I couldn't properly appreciate it due to the very bad quality of the image and sound, and, well, simply terrible. Still, I think I managed to catch enough of the content. By the time you watch this video, maybe the movie is already out where I live. I don't know. Let's just hope I got this right. And if indeed the movie is out at my end, I will definitely watch it, see if I can get more information out of it. So let's get started. Midsommar, 2019 movie written and directed by Ari Aster, which enters in the category of horror. Let's talk about this, and spoilers alert, obviously. If you are interested in Norse mythology and, well, Scandinavian folk traditions, and if you haven't seen the movie yet, I strongly advise you not to take it as an actual horror movie, so you can better appreciate the cultural background presented in the movie. As I've said, I do not see it entirely as horror. In fact, I think the horror part is secondary in here, since the movie is very rich in symbolisms and a variety of motifs and elements associated with ancient Nordic religion and cultural traditions. Let's not focus on the first part of the movie and, the psychological impact on the main characters and what leads them to go to Sweden. Let's just go straight to the cultural background, because indeed that is the purpose of this video. But just because I'm not going to speak about the beginning, do pay close attention to the movie, because there are certain Easter eggs which are quite interesting. And right in the beginning of the movie, pay close attention to the pictures on the wall in Dani's house, the main character, because it's directly linked to events at the end of the movie. Quite interesting. So, jumping into the part that we want to explore. Dani, with her boyfriend, Christian, and his friends go to spend the summer in Sweden. They have the opportunity to witness firsthand and take part on the Midsommar celebration with the Arga in a village where Pelle grew up, one of Christian's friends. In this particular place, the celebration occurs every 90 years, and the celebration itself lasts 9 days. So, a celebration every 90 years with the duration of 9 days indeed sounds a lot like the descriptions given by Adam of Bremen about the celebrations at the temple of Old Uppsala in Sweden. Every 9 years at Old Uppsala, sacrifices were held at least to 3 main deities: Odin, Frigg, Freyr, and Thor. Both animal and human sacrifices. So this little detail of 90 years and 9 days, the number 9, already gives us a hint of what will probably happen on the course of the celebration. The people from this community have their own unique way of living. They live a life focused on preserving ancient traditions. You really have this sense of detachment from the rest of the world. These people have their own rules, their specific laws, and a way of thinking absolutely focused on values, which are very characteristic of communities that try to preserve the traditions of their ancestors. This is another point that I really liked, because Dani, Christian, and friends go to this place with a sort of mentality, or rather, with the predisposition to have contact with this community precisely from the point of view of outsiders, going to interact with something exotic, just a community of bush weirdos, out of the ordinary from the lives they are used to of the modern world. And this is exactly where the clash of mentalities start, because what they thought it was going to be exotic proves to be a more complex environment, with its own laws, rules, values, and the characters have a series of problems in understanding the manner in which things are conducted, and the belief systems, and the entire moral behind the actions, because they simply do not belong to that world. That community expresses the sort of mentality that just doesn't fit anymore in our modern societies. And this perspective is very important to understand the entire movie, because the clash of mentalities and the ignorance towards cultural aspects leads the characters to disrespect certain aspects of the religious life of these people. The characters don't disrespect on purpose. They simply don't know, and they show disrespect unwillingly in most cases. Now, one of the traditions that is presented to us is the Midsommar festival, a seasonal holiday that represents the middle of summer. In the movie, in this particular festival, it is portrayed some ancient religious elements. And this is quite important because among scholars throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, there has always been this perception that ancient pagans were all about the fertility of the land, festivities around the harvest cycles, which isn't far from the truth, at least this last point, but always giving indications that it was rather peaceful, and this idea was highly romanticized precisely by 19th century neo-paganisms, especially within Wicca. Every religious celebration around the wheel of the year and the harvest cycle and so on. But things were more complex than that. And I think the movie has a very good portrayal of that precisely, because it wasn't indeed just about dancing and singing. It also required offerings, sacrifice, and let's not forget that to ancient pagans, there wasn't a perceptible division between magic and religion. Magic was very much part of the religion and the expression of faith. I'm focusing on this particular aspect on purpose because in many neo-paganisms, especially Wicca and Algiz, since the formation of these neo-pagan faiths in the 19th century, for far too long it has been considered that the Germanic pagan tradition is much more focused in traditions and religious practices of the community in which magic has a secondary role. As an archaeologist and historian, I must disagree with this, and actually, fortunately, the great majority of academics and researchers share a similar idea to my own. In truth, it's precisely the opposite. The religious practices in terms of Germanic culture, during prehistory all the way to the Viking Age, were characterized by a great insertion of magic, of magical performances both in daily life and public life, to the point that it is almost impossible to separate the two realities, especially in the archaeological record and as well as in the literary sources. Religion in ancient Scandinavia had a lot of magic. So indeed, I think the movie made a pretty decent portrayal, because it's not just dancing and chanting. In the movie, you clearly see a variety of religious performances and magic during this festivity. The movie focuses on one particular celebration, and throughout the movie you have human sacrifice, midsummer festivity in itself, dancing around the pole, the election of the queen, the May Queen tradition, the harvest and fertility aspects, chanting, runic inscriptions, and a variety of other elements. Speaking of human sacrifice, it is the very first scene of impact. Two of the older members among the villagers, a woman named Hilva and a man that I didn't quite cock the name, they are both the guests of honor. They practice a breathing exercise before the whole community follows them to the edge of a cliff. There is a good element of surprise on the part of the newcomers, Danny and friends. It is expressed the misunderstanding that the characters experience in the face of this religious expression of human sacrifice. It's quite difficult for the characters in understanding the whole symbolic process within the moment of the sacrificial ritual and how it is important for the religious beliefs of the community. And because of this inability to understand the values, laws, and even moral expressed in the sacrifice, it creates a lot of problems between the outsiders and the community. What the hell? The clash of mentality. The characters end up suffering terrible consequences due to the inability to understand the traditional ways of this community. The human sacrifice presented to us in this movie is pretty interesting for two main reasons that are opposed to one another. In the movie, these two people are the older members of the community, and they decided that their time has come. They want to die. They no longer feel like they should continue on living because their best years are already gone. So they voluntarily give themselves to be sacrificed, to give something beneficial to the community. Their lives will help providing something useful in the context of the festival. Human sacrifice in Scandinavia was exactly that. The human was an offering to the specific deity that the person was being sacrificed to in exchange for the help and beneficial power of the deity over the entire community. For instance, people sacrificed human beings to Thor to end famine and plague, or sacrificed to Odin in war contexts. Let's not delve too much on that. The point is, human sacrifice wasn't taken lightly, and it was done in times of great need and to ensure a successful future. And I particularly enjoy this idea of older people voluntarily offering themselves to be sacrificed. And I think Ari Esther in here touches a very delicate subject of our modern society, which is euthanasia, and our modern society's religious conceptions around suicide. The thing is, and I've already made a video about it, so if you want to check it, please click on this information icon. In ancient societies, suicide was quite common. Suicide was highly forbidden by Abrahamic religious perceptions, but non-Abrahamic and old pagan societies accepted suicide, and in Scandinavia it wasn't different. In fact, during the Middle Ages, life was especially hard for those who reached old age, especially within societies that relied on activities that required strength and vitality. Old people were easy targets, and many would reach an age that they felt that they no longer have any usefulness in the societies they lived in. Not only that, but old age, as it still happens today, unfortunately, brought loneliness, and many old people also wanted to die with some dignity left in them before reaching a point that they would completely lose control over their own bodies and mind. There are a couple of places in nowadays Scandinavia, especially Norway, whose place names remote to the Middle Ages and are places linked to suicide, specific places, mostly cliffs, where people would commit suicide. This was a voluntary act, and it is presented to us as such in the movie. However, when it comes to human sacrifices in old Scandinavia, it wasn't quite like this. Human sacrifices were in fact far more brutal than they have been portrayed in movies. If we take a look at the literary sources about the Viking Age, we never find an account where a person voluntarily accepts to be sacrificed. The account of Ibn Fadlan is a good example of that. The written source, not the movie. Because the movie portrays the sacrifice as being something voluntarily done. And I'll explain that further ahead. If we take a look at the sagas, human sacrifices are always described as being performed by force, without people's consent, and even trickery is used to lead people into sacrifice. And this is very well portrayed as well in the Norse mythology itself. And also we have the case, for instance, within the Ynglinga saga, in which it is said that King Olaf did not perform the sacrifices that often as it should be done, and that greatly displeased the Swedes, which thought that the cause for famine was precisely because the king was lazy and didn't often sacrifice. So the Swedes gathered up an army and marched against the king, taking him by surprise, taking him by force, burning him alive in his own house, thus giving him as a sacrifice to Odin so they could have a good year of harvest, and so famine would end. This is just one example of the innumerable examples of human sacrifice, which was always by force. If human sacrifices in the Viking period, and possibly even in earlier periods, were not made voluntarily, why do the movies and television series insist on portraying them as something voluntarily? The answer is quite simple. Writers and directors take the safer and smarter course of not wanting the characters to be associated with such brutal practices, because it's really a pretty sensitive subject in terms of moral, modern perspectives of our days. Representing human sacrifice as something voluntarily transmits a certain tolerance towards ancient pagan practices if to those who are being sacrificed it is given some freedom and dignity. The theme of death and killing is ethically defensible and always causes an upheaval of arguments that can be quite the negative feedback to series and movies. So Ari Hester took the usual safer course, yet he introduced an important aspect of euthanasia, which created a good argument to continue to portray sacrifice in ancient societies, especially Scandinavian ones, as something voluntarily. Well played. Human sacrifice is something we nowadays may never be truly able to understand due to our modern mentalities, but in the past it was an important aspect in the religious background of old Scandinavians. I dare say it was fundamental as an expression of faith towards existence itself and everything life incorporates, such as life itself, death, sacrifice, regeneration, the divine and nature itself. And all these aspects compose the very structure of all ethical perspectives. And our inability to understand this nowadays is truly well portrayed in this movie, in the characters that play the role of outsiders. Ari Aster tried to avoid certain ethical aspects, but at the same time he introduces a controversial aspect, which is euthanasia. It's interesting to see that in the movies people accept rather well when people sacrifice themselves willingly, voluntarily, for something good. They die. But then in real life, they can't accept euthanasia as a means that also provides dignity to the ones who are willing to die. Again, well played, Ari Aster, well played. But anyway, human sacrifices in Scandinavia were performed in rare moments. The people who would be sacrificed were usually slaves, criminals, and children. The latter was less frequent, but it happened. But indeed, in the movie, you only have 2 sacrifices that went voluntarily. Actually, 4, but we shall get to that later. All the other human sacrifices are somewhat unwillingly, as a sort of punishment for their actions of disrespecting certain aspects within the community. One sacrifice is even chosen by the queen, by Dany. But there is nothing in the sources that gives us any indication that this was done. I mean, the tradition of the May Queen choosing a human sacrifice. And just one last point on this part of human sacrifice portrayed in the movie. I was particularly interested in the fact of the destruction of the heads of the human victims. We have already seen that Ari Aster is pretty cunning, so I have no doubt that the destruction of the head was indeed on purpose in the movie, related to traditional aspects of the religion of the Norse. Not just the destruction of the heads of the older members, but the choice of heads in the last sacrifice in the movie. We shall get to that. To many ancient civilizations, and indeed until very late, the head has always been perceived as the seat of the soul, where the soul or spirit resides. The Celts, Slavic, Old German, Norse, Lusitanians, and so on believed that the soul spirit or essence of the person resided within the human head. The human head was the seat of the human spirit, and so the human head played an important role in their religious conceptions. The head was the symbol of individuality and identity, and it symbolized the power of the divine within the individual itself. The head was the vessel of an individual's power. Now, in terms of sacrifice, it was necessary the destruction of matter, be that object, plant, animal, or human, precisely to release the essence within the object itself. The purpose of sacrifice in ancient cultures was exactly this, not to offer the object or animal or human, but offering what resided within the offering, the power, essence, might and strength. I've already talked about that on the Meigin video. Judging by what we know from literary sources, and obviously from the archaeological record, it seems there was no clear distinction between sacrificing animate and inanimate materials. Artifacts were also understood as imbued with life, so the term sacrifice could be applied to objects as well. So destroying a human, animal, plant, or object was to release the essence of that matter and give it as an offering to the supernatural forces in exchange for the same essence, but from supernatural forces that have a direct impact upon the human world and what humans need to survive. So Ari Hester composes an interesting connection with the concept of the seat of the soul in the head and the destruction of matter in sacrifice to release the essence. Midsommar, or Midsummer, represents the middle of summer and therefore is related to an important old festivity, since it represents the period of the day when sunlight is most intense at a time when the day has a longer duration than the night. It is said to be an important and magical period for the ancient peoples of Europe, a factor actually represented in the movie, as previously said. As for the characters of the community, the festivity was indeed understood as a unique time of the year, and therefore it was celebrated for 9 days. The number 9, again, is a recurrent and important symbol for the Germanic world, considering that it is a number that is related to mythology as well. The number 9 is portrayed in myth at various times. The number of days that the god Odin remained in Yggdrasil in his sacrifice to obtain the knowledge of the runes. In Nordic cosmology as well, since in the Nordic myths there are 9 worlds, among several other themes all across literary sources in relation to the number 9, including later on during the Icelandic late Middle Ages and modern period, with the Icelandic magical staves. We see the number 27 occurring in many symbols and sigils, the multiplication of the number 9 over itself 3 times. And obviously, this leads me to speak about the runic symbols and the runes themselves, as they are present in the movie several times. As you know, the runes were a form of writing from ancient Scandinavia. They were used, embedded, or carved in a variety of surfaces and materials. The runes come from a very ancient past, quite possibly not originally from the Germanic world, since the oldest runes we find already as a form of writing an actual alphabet date back to 6,000 years ago, and they are found in northern Portugal. That's right. There is even a very ancient Lusitanian goddess, somewhat associated with the very concept of the runes. But that is a very extensive subject for another time, another video. Anyway, it's clear that the runes during the Viking Age were used as a form of writing, but in earlier periods, at least during the Germanic Iron Age, runic symbols were the stylized representation of a variety of different forces and principles in the universe and the human existence. So they were also used in religious practices, in the great majority of cases for divination purposes, as we have talked about before in this channel several times. You are probably wondering about the last part with the bear and the sacrifice, placing the character Christian, Danny's boyfriend, inside a bear. I don't know what the hell was that all about. I can only think of some folk tale out there that I might not be aware of yet. In the beginning of the movie, one of the pictures on the wall in Danny's house has a bear and a child in it. So it's already giving us a hint of what will happen in the end of the movie. I mean, Danny is the queen of the Midsommar festivity. She is chosen. So the only thing I can think of is the bear. It's an actual title of a fairy tale in which a princess is kept inside a castle because the king is afraid that some harm might come to her. The princess complains to her nurse about it, and the nurse is actually a witch in disguise. The witch told the princess to get a wheelbarrow and a bear skin from the king. The king gave it to them, and the nurse enchanted them, and when the princess put on the bear skin, it disguised her. She became a bear. And when she got into the wheelbarrow, it took her everywhere she wanted to go, and so she went into the forest. A prince hunted her. But when she called to him to call off his dogs, he was so astounded that he asked her to come home with him. She ended up being mistreated by the prince. She was still shapeshifted into a bear, so the prince would kick the bear. So I don't know how far this could be a reference to this tale, because indeed Danny's boyfriend could be the prince and he wasn't very good to her, and in the end she became the queen. So it would be a nice twist from the part of Ari Hester to somehow change the roles and let the prince, in this case Christian, suffer inside the bearskin. But it might be something deeper, because in the movie, drugged Christian is led into a ceremony to have sexual intercourse with his friend's sister. I believe the name of the character is Maya, and she's a virgin. He has sex with her while the other elder females stand nude around them and mimic Maya's moaning. After Danny is crowned May Queen, she watches Christian having sex with Maya through a hole in the door, which causes Danny to have an outbreak, a breakdown. After climaxing, an absolutely confused and disoriented Christian runs out to try and find Danny, but he ends up discovering some of his friends that went missing and were now dead. One of them, an English guy who wasn't part of the group, Simon, I believe, whose mutilated corpse was in a shed and being used as a blood eagle. Moments later, Christian is found and knocked out when a villager blows powder in his face, which leaves Christian completely paralyzed, and they put him inside a bear, a disemboweled bear. So there is an interesting sequence of events here. Sex and death are merged into a single rite of passage. Christian, metaphorically speaking, shapeshifts into a bear, and after his sexual performance in a ceremony of fertility, he is used as a sacrifice inside the bear. There's something I'm missing in here, so please try to figure this one out in the comments below. Anyway, reaching the very end, 9 people are to be sacrificed. This includes the 2 elders, 4 outsiders, 2 living volunteers, and 1 chosen by Danny, the May Queen. After what she has seen and all the things she goes through, and her failing relationship with Christian, she picks Christian as the 9th sacrifice. The dead sacrifices and the living sacrifices are placed in a golden tent, pyramid-like, a teepee, which is then set on fire. I do not perceive this as something related to Scandinavian traditions, except for the fact that in the continental Germanic world, human sacrifices were burnt, usually slaves in the cult of Nerthos, indeed a fertility deity, and sacrifices related to fertility. Immolation was performed by old Germans in a fertility cult, indeed, so it may be a reference to that. But of course, there are several elements there that are solely from Ari Hester's imagination to augment the weirdness and horror. I think the movie Midsommar is quite different from the typical stereotypes commonly found in other film productions, where paganism or ancient civilizations or ancient rituals and magic are usually portrayed as something evil or absurd. In this movie, it's not a question of being good or evil. It's about a clash of mentalities. And the traditions established by the community are their own reality. They compose a variety of values and beliefs that are seen as normal, and so they behave accordingly to their religious beliefs and their old traditions. So they do not act to purposely cause harm, although the disrespect shown by the outsiders due to ignorance leads the people of the community to punish them. But again, sacrifices were needed, and even though Ari Hester wanted to escape from the usual ethical problems of forced sacrifice in ancient cultures that might cause some negativity from the part of the audience, he managed to include forced sacrifice anyway, but tried to cover it with the disrespect they had as a justification in a horror movie, so the audience won't protest that much. Oh, okay, they done goofed, they deserve to be sacrificed. Okay, all is well. And it's also a good movie that portrays the impact certain cultures have upon the minds of those who are unfamiliar to them. So, in a certain way, this horror expressed in the movie, I think it's precisely the exaggeration of the metaphorical fear people create and have when they don't understand about a particular culture and concoct all sorts of terrible sceneries worse than reality. Precisely what we have witnessed in history, the demonization of people who practiced witchcraft and the degradation of the figure of the witch. Christianity portraying pagans as the worst sort of people performing all sorts of strange things, just like Christians portrayed the Vikings as bloodthirsty brutes who punished people by carving the blood eagle on their backs, which is nothing more than a literary creation. It wasn't an actual practice. So it's a movie which has rich elements that are certainly worthy of attention, and I thoroughly enjoyed the movie precisely trying to figure out the cultural elements behind it. My dear friends, I didn't know I had so much to say about the movie, and if indeed in the future it comes out in the theaters at my end, and I can finally watch it with a good quality of both image and sound, I will probably have even more to say. I didn't expect the video to be that long. I'm sorry. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, tack för idag.